The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So hello, everybody, and welcome. This is the ISCDO How CDOs Succeed broadcast of the webinar series that we've been running here for almost 2 years now. Our special guest today is Randy Bean, and I'll introduce him in just a minute. But very important information that we have here for you today, and we're so thankful that Randy can take the time to join us in all of this. The society is set up to help data leadership all the way around, and we're a relatively new profession. So the research that Randy is going to be presenting today is so incredibly important for our profession. And the most important thing that you should know about this research is that Randy is vociferous about it. He's been asking the same groups of people the same questions for at least 10 years in many cases. So we have not only a good snapshot of where we are now, but how this has been evolving. We're looking forward to a lot of questions and answers and interaction on this. If you do have questions and things, we've got you all on mute because there's a bunch of you out there, but there is a questions feature in the control panel for the GoToWebinar component there. Drop your questions in that, or send them directly to Randy or I, but we may have to get email on this, so that's probably the best way to do it on that. Let's go ahead and get started here. So we've known Randy for a long time, as I mentioned. That's not because we're both relatively old, but we've been in this business for a while. And so he has a company called NewVantage Partners, and one of the things you can do with a company is business type research. So while he has a phenomenal background going all the way back to Kleiner Perkins days and things like that, he's doing all kinds of other additional work that's in there, but he's a thought leader in this area. And one of the reasons he's a thought leader is because specifically he's asking questions that are relevant to us as data leadership professionals, and that's an incredibly good thing. He also has a huge amount of philanthropic activities, everything from helping our main conference that we do at MIT coming up in July of this year to just various other things that you can see here on the screen. And so Randy, we are so fortunate to have you here today. Have I given you a good introduction? Did I leave anything out that you wanted to say that people would know about you before you get started on this?
Well, first of all, Peter, I'd like to thank you for the very generous introduction and kind words. I would add that have been both a practitioner for the better part of more decades than I choose to mention, as well as an advisor to leading Fortune 1000 companies and companies of all sizes over the course of the past 2 decades, and have really been at ground zero of the formation of the Chief Data Officer role. The first enterprise chief data officer for a top bank, in this case Citigroup, and the year was 2009, came out of our firm. So he was a partner of our firm and then was hired by Citigroup to be their first enterprise chief data officer. So I've really been a witness to the formation of this role and how it's evolved over the course of the past decade and more now. And we actually continue to work with organizations, even serving as interim chief data officers and helping them define the role and function on an interim basis until they hire incumbents in that role. So pleased to be with you today and pleased to share the results of this survey.
Absolutely, and your thoughts on the profession in general. So we're not going to confine it to the survey results here. Hopefully everybody's screen is showing Randy's piece, and Randy, I'll let you take it away. You said there were 6 areas that you had been mainly tracking in this particular instance.
Yes, and I will touch upon the major themes. So I assume everybody can see the background, which Peter, you covered nicely. A couple things to mention. When big data came into common usage as a term in the early 2010s, I was asked by the Wall Street Journal to write a monthly column on big data, which I did during 2014 and 2015. Subsequently, I've been writing a similar column for Forbes, big data, AI, and the role of the chief data officer, and also write frequently in Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan Management Review, specifically doing a series with both of them. So some of you may have seen a piece that was published on February 5th in terms of the challenges organizations are facing in becoming data-driven, and a piece as part of a series that co-authoring with Tom Davenport that appeared just this past week in terms of organizations continuing to struggle with leadership for data activities. The other thing I'd mention, since I have the opportunity, is that I used the COVID period when I couldn't travel to pull a lot of this together into my first book, which is being published by Wiley and will appear on August 31st of this year. And it's entitled Fail Fast, Learn Faster, Lessons in Data-Driven Leadership in an Age of Disruption, Big Data, and AI. So a mouthful there, but kind of a key takeaway is this notion of fail fast, and learn faster. The idea that companies, to be innovative, need to try new things. It's really borrowing from the principle of test and learn in the analytics setting. So innovative organizations should, above all other things, be trying things, be it in centers of excellence or analytical sandboxes, and that is a great way to move data initiatives forward. As Peter mentioned, I will also be the moderator and host of MIT Chief Data Officer panel, which I've done for the past 7 years, and I'll speak a little bit more about that at the end. And I'm founder and chief executive of NewVantage Partners, a strategic advisory firm, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year.
And Randy, if I can just interrupt right there too, you have offices in Boston, New York, San Francisco, and Raleigh. So that's an impressive footprint around that.
Yeah, it's national in scope. And since you ask, we advise in one form or another most of the major financial services firms, among other things. So the major banks, insurance companies, payments firms, and asset management firms, as well as major healthcare and pharmaceuticals, life sciences companies, among others, plus a range of firms across industries, but heavy concentration in financial services and life sciences. And it was out of that, we host a series of what once upon a time was executive dinners, which evolved into executive breakfasts. I call these executive roundtable breakfasts, where we'd bring together about 16 to 20 C executives from leading Fortune 1000 companies. Back in the 2000s, this was often the CIO, CTO, or whoever it was that had responsibility for data within the organization. In the past decade, it's largely been chief data officers, chief analytics officers, also some combination of chief digital and chief marketing officers, and a continuation of CIOs as well. And during one of these breakfasts in 2012, as it so happened, a CIO from JP Morgan said, you know, I'm reading and hearing about big data, and I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure what the implications are for our organization. And would it be possible to survey some of the firms that you advise and speak with so that we could get a picture of what firms are doing in terms of their data initiatives and what big data means for them? So in 2012, we launched the first Big Data Executive Survey, which subsequently became the Big Data and AI Executive Survey. So we're now into, next year will be the 10th year of conducting this survey. My colleague Tom Davenport, who's an advisor and fellow with NewVantage Partners, co-authors the foreword with me. So as he notes, it's been nearly a full decade since this executive survey was first launched, and much progress has been made, but much work to be done. Moving to the next slide, just to give you a sense of the participants. In terms of 2021, there were 85 major companies that were represented. They are shown on the slide. They represent blue chip Fortune 1000 leaders. And this is really about a 50% increase in just the past 3 years from the number of participating firms in 2018. And what has been noted about the survey in particular is that it's small, but it's focused at the top of the house executives. So it's focused at the senior most executive responsible for data initiatives within these large organizations. And you can see some of the major financial services and insurance firms that participate. For example, American Express and Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, MasterCard, Visa, among the participants, and then also heavy participation from healthcare and life sciences. So you can see leading healthcare providers there, including vaccine creators like Pfizer, for example, and leaders like CVS Health. And then you can also see a smattering of consumer, business services, and government participants, and these include, among others, Bloomberg, McDonald's, Starbucks, and Walmart. And just on the left-hand side, you'll see a photograph, which is what you would see if and when the MIT Chief Data Officer Symposium goes live again. So that's a view of Boston as seen from the campus of MIT. Any question, Peter, do you have any comments or questions at this point before I launch into some of the details?
Yeah, I just think it's important to take a quick note that while you've been publishing in these areas for 10 years, I've been working in the academic side of things as well, and they are completely unaware of these survey results. So just maybe towards the end, you could comment on why you think publications like Forbes and HBR are really interested in this, but for some reason there is not an interest in the academic community around these kinds of results.
Yeah, the only thing I can tell you for certain is that one of the reasons that we continued this survey was that it was embraced by the mainstream business press. In other words, the Wall Street Journal and Forbes have written extensively about the survey findings and the challenges that organizations face in becoming data-driven and gaining traction around the chief data officer role. Within the academic community, MIT has been very dedicated through the Chief Data Officer Symposium and also through MIT Sloan Management Review, where have published probably now well over a dozen to 15 articles on the topic in recent years, and have also conducted webinars for MIT Sloan Management Review. Similarly, Harvard University, Harvard Business Review has published many articles and just did a webinar with them in December. Gradually engaging with more and more academic institutions. Recently, Northeastern University in Boston, Washington University in St. Louis, and Colby College in Maine have been some of the organizations that have reached out that are starting up more focused career development curriculums, particularly to groom a next generation of chief data officers and data scientists. So, you know, I will mention that in publishing this new book, the publishers were anxious that the message get out as soon as possible. So I mentioned that obviously engage a lot in the corporate world, but also saw an opportunity to engage more with the academic world. And their comments to me was that the academic world tends to be followers in this regard, which surprised me a little bit, but I'm just relating that message from the publisher's perspective.
I think it's an accurate description, though. It's unfortunate, and I have a personal commitment to try and increase the engagement on that side. And you're right, there are a lot of good universities that are jumping out. Another one we should mention is University of Little Rock.
Yeah,
University of Arkansas, Little Rock as well on that. Yeah, let's dive into the survey results, because this is really good stuff.
Absolutely. So this is just an expansion upon what I was alluding to before in terms of participation, heavy concentration in financial services. And I'll say a word about that. The participation in financial services is not arbitrary. Financial services firms, probably more than any other industry, have been investing for many decades in developing data practices and data capabilities because they have so much data, and it's very precise data in terms of customer behavior and transaction history. Healthcare and life sciences, though, as you can see when you look at the increase from 2018 to 2021 and the previous year as well, are coming on rapidly. Healthcare and life sciences firms generate vast amounts of information. They have access to significant amounts of information, but historically, many of their practices have been fragmented and decentralized, and they haven't had the level of maturity that financial services had. A lot of this has been highlighted in the recent year in terms of the efforts of life sciences and healthcare firms to understand the data around COVID-19 and also subsequently to develop vaccines. So there's been so much data, and it can be, there's the need to aggregate it, but there's also a critical need to interpret it in a way that is beneficial to basically to society. And in terms of the respondent roles, I just note, as mentioned previously, it's really focused on the top C executives that have responsibility for data within an organization. So this year, 93% of the survey participants were C executives, and just over 3/4 of the respondents held the role of chief data officer or chief analytics officer. And as many of you know, for a number of organizations, there's been a trend in recent years to combine the CDO and CAO functions into the Chief Data and Analytics Officer function. So we're saying that as well. I'll jump into the first of the several themes that we'll go through. And Peter, feel free to comment or ask any questions along the way before we open up for a full set of questions.
For sure.
The first theme, which probably should be no surprise to anyone, is companies are investing in big data and AI initiatives. As you can see, it's been nearly universal over the past few years. In 2021, it's as universal as it comes. It's hard to imagine the 1% that are not investing in data initiatives. One might ask, what are they thinking? I should qualify this as well. When we use the term big data, and it's at the outset of the survey, we explain that we're using this term as a catch-all, so it can be actually mean large sets of data or very small sets. It can be structured data or unstructured data. It can be numbers, it can be pictures, but we're basically referring to any type of data, and have continued to use this term big data because even though among specialists it may mean something precise, the term is used widely and commonly in the press and in the media to really refer to the vast proliferation of data over the past decades. So it really means all things data. I'd also note that the pace of investment in data and AI has continued to increase. We noted a sharp drop off last year in 2020, which when we probed it was really ascribed to organizations digesting a number of the things that they'd been developing, taking a pause to make sure that they were demonstrating some measurable results, business value, but in 2021, we saw the pace accelerating again. And then in terms of accumulated investment in big data and AI initiatives, that's continued to grow. So over 62% of organizations are now investing greater than or have invested greater than $50 million. So it's a substantial investment, and it continues to grow. But moving to a second theme, and for me, this is really the heart of the survey in many respects, because we ask organizations about the progress that they're making. And over the years, we've moved to ask these questions in a very binary fashion. So organizations are, they can't answer like kind of, maybe, sort of. They basically have to say yes or no. So we say, are you driving innovation with data? Yes or no. Are you competing on data and analytics? Yes or no. Do you have a well-articulated data strategy? Yes or no. Have you forged a data culture? Yes or no. And when forced to choose, the results that we see are, in some respects, you could call them disheartening or disturbing. But what they really point to is a glass that is half full in many respects, because there's been considerable progress made, because some of these numbers are respectable in terms of the total universe, but also a long ways to go. So there's many pieces of good news in that. One is that, in a way, you could say that this guarantees lifelong employment, or certainly, if not for a generation, the better part of the coming decade, in helping organizations forge a data culture, helping them become data-driven. So many challenges to overcome, many opportunities for organizations to take their data initiatives to the next level. But for those who may believe that we're there today, the results suggest that there's a lot of challenges, a long way to go, and much work to be done. And I'll just pause there, Peter, if you have any comments or reactions.
We're getting some questions in the chat, so I want to make sure that we can get to them. But you did note that there seems to be a difference between 1920 and 21, and that it went up a little bit and then went down. Any kind of insight in that? I use that as an excuse to say we need more research in the area, but we really need groups to fund that research. Is what comes back to it. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot, and I'll answer it two different ways. One is there's, as you saw at the outset, there's been a growth in the number of organizations that participate. So, one answer could be that some of the organizations that are participating now, or more recently, are further behind in the evolution of their data and analytics capabilities. But I actually believe that the correct answer, at least in my opinion, is that organizations started out a little over-optimistically and maybe estimated how advanced they were in terms of having forged a data culture, or being data-driven, or driving innovation with data. And as they've actually progressed their capabilities, they've come up with a more realistic assessment of where they stand and the challenges that remain. So personally, because I can attest firsthand, I'd go into many organizations and they'd say, oh, we have everything under control. We are doing just great. The business community loves us. We're adding tremendous value. And then I'd speak to the business community within those organizations, the business leaders, and they didn't share that perspective to the same degree. So it's not surprising that many organizations may have recalibrated their assessment of their own capabilities based upon experience and the realization that, one of the things, I'll answer it this way, one of the things that I see when I walk into many organizations is you speak to the folks that are responsible for data, and they speak about the wonderful capabilities that they've created, and you speak with the technology folks, and they'll echo that in terms of the technology capabilities. But when you speak with the line of business leaders, often they'll say, we're not seeing the benefits, we're not realizing the value, it's not enabling us to serve our customers better necessarily, we don't necessarily have greater confidence in the data that we're seeing. So there's a tremendous challenge, which I'll speak to shortly, in terms of the cultural obstacles and the need to essentially communicate very effectively what the benefits are of the data initiatives, and to ensure that organizations can actually realize value, and that the investments in data tied to very tangible and measurable business outcomes.
Super, thank you for that.
Moving to theme 3, which I just touched upon, is that when started this business 20 years ago, was operating under the assumption that we were going to be focused 95% on technology challenges and 5% on the other stuff. And what I've learned over the interceding 20 years is it's really been the opposite in our experience. There's plenty of technology. In many or most instances, technology is ahead of the capacity of organizations to absorb and apply and derive value from the technology capabilities. And the real challenges for for the vast majority of organizations, 92+% in this case, revolve around cultural challenges: people, business process, organizational alignment, change management. Because managing data, data flows across an organization. Companies, at least traditional mainstream legacy companies, were never organized around data. If you're Amazon or Google, that's something entirely different, but that's not the representative universe. So companies have to undergo a significant cultural transformation in order to become data-driven, in order to determine how best to manage data within the organization, and to learn how to derive value and ensure that the business constituents that are closest to the customers are getting what they need in the ways that they need it to be most effective. A couple other points. On the other hand, organizations are steadily reporting successful outcomes from their big data and AI investments. So this year it's approaching nearly universal in terms of deriving some value, some significant measurable value. There's, for the first time this year, we asked about level of optimism. So the outlook and optimism for the future is high in spite of the challenges that remain today. And interestingly, we asked organizations how they characterize themselves. The leading answer was that a majority, or the plurality of firms, viewed themselves as leaders, though it's less than a majority. A significant percentage viewed themselves as followers. So firms continue to struggle with the challenges of becoming data-driven, and there is, as we've discussed, there's plenty of opportunity and need. Shifting gears, I'll speak a little bit about the Chief Data Officer role. When we first conducted the survey in 2012, only 12% of organizations that participated responded that they had a Chief Data Officer. That number peaked in 2019, fell off a little in 2020, and improved again in 2021. I'm asked, why did this number fall off for a year or so? And my firsthand experience was that, first of all, have seen a lot of change and transition in the CDO role in terms of incumbency. It has, for a number of organizations, been a bit of a revolving door as the organizations help define and shape the role. And as it matures, I've seen a number of the largest banks that are on anywhere from their third to as many as their fifth or even sixth Chief Data Officer. There was also some organizations, American Express would be an example, that after their Chief Data Officer left in 2019, made a conscious decision not to fill it until recently, in this past year, when they appointed Danielle Kropp to the CDO role. But they spent about 18 months to 2 years debating whether there was a need for the Chief Data Officer within their organization. And I speak to a range of organizations who have not yet appointed Chief Data Officers and continue to debate whether this is a role that's needed or not. Some firms have very consciously decided not to appoint a Chief Data Officer. Fidelity Investments is a firm that I work with that has not appointed a Chief Data Office and has steadily resisted that. I was speaking with Sun Life Financial yesterday, large global insurance firm. They have not appointed a Chief Data Officer. So though roughly 2/3 of organizations now have, there's still a significant percentage, roughly a third, that have not. And then in terms of primary responsibility for data within an organization, it's still interesting to note that more than half of organizations, it still doesn't reside with the chief data or chief data and analytics officer. And roughly a quarter of organizations still point to no single point of accountability for data within the organization. So there still is not a firm consensus on either where data should report or even that there is a single point of accountability for data within a company. So I'll pause there for a moment and speak to any questions on this topic before dig a little deeper into the chief data officer role.
We're diving some very good questions here. Here's one that has come in that's pertinent to the slide that we're finished. Do you break down the people, process, culture challenges any further? Given that it's 90%, it'd be helpful to see a greater breakdown of this. I guess that was the previous slide.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is not presently. In the past, we've asked varying gradations of that. In other words, I'm just trying to think of examples. We asked about whether there was, we asked questions like, was there support at the top of the organization, at the CEO level? Did they see part of the problem as a lack of leadership from the top? And we asked questions about, did they see some of the challenges as being a lack of buy-in in the middle of the organization? So we simplified that question a little bit just for the sake of, to make it more presentable, but I agree that it's an area that we should probe deeper into in subsequent surveys.
And just a quick note, there was a comment on here that there are some journals that are now starting to pick up your survey and academics that are starting to use this in there. And I think that's actually a good sign. So thanks for the comment on that. We'll let you go on to theme 5, Randy.
Okay. Let's see. So as mentioned, firms are continuing to struggle with the chief data officer role and clarify what its mandate is. And this, along with the slide that we referenced earlier that talked about where organizations were in terms of the maturity of their initiatives and whether they were data-driven or had a data culture. I find this one of the most interesting slides where it talks about profile of a successful chief data officer, because I see this and observe this as something of a pendulum, where I see organizations where they say, we need to bring in an outsider who has a fresh perspective, isn't afraid of breaking glass, take no prisoners, will tell us all of the things that we're doing wrong and the things that we need to do right. And then when that happens, they say, well, we don't like that very much, and the person didn't really know our company and our culture, and they didn't understand us, and so thank you very much, but it didn't provide the value that we needed. And then they revert to the company veteran or the insider who has been with the organization for many years, maybe decades, knows how the company works, knows how to get things done. But then often that person might not bring the element of change and the mandate for change. And then you see the organization potentially reverting back in some form to the external change agent and expert. We also see some other permutations here. We see organizations looking to align a business executive who's owned business results, who understands numbers, who understands the business and knows how to drive to successful business outcomes. We see organizations that are turning to data scientists and analytics leaders, because they realize that those are the people that know how to derive value from data. And we also see some instances of organizations turning to technology executives that may be proficient in issues around data management. So in 2021, it was really the outsider change agent that was the dominant role, but you know, a majority continues to be a mix of other qualifications.
And Randy, I'll make a little point here that we saw the same kind of thing with the role of CIOs initially. And one of the things we're trying to do with all of this is avoid some of the confusion that was occurring around that particular piece. Different story, different topic, but I think that's a pattern that we want to try to avoid if we can going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd point out a few things here since you make that point, Peter. And one is that you know, the CDO role has really emerged and developed its own persona now, if you will. But 10 years ago, people were saying, well, there's a chief information officer, and information is in the name. So if we have a chief information officer, why do we need a chief data officer? What's the difference? But I think that we're well past that now. Some people would actually make the comment that CIO is more of a chief infrastructure officer, which CIOs may or may not like, but maybe perhaps a more accurate reflection. And the data officer is really focused on all manifestations of data and information. In the executive breakfasts or roundtables that we hold, a number of CDOs have pointed out the fact that they think that Chief Data Officer, the CDO, really means or stands for Chief Diplomatic Officer, because they're really, in many respects, have been more of an influencer, and they need to develop buy-in and support across the organization to really be successful in the role.
And I think that leads directly to your next point, because people don't associate data with revenue on that. And that is exactly what your survey is reporting here.
Yeah, the number of organizations where the CDO has revenue responsibility is small, 13% roughly, and it hasn't changed in 4 years. So it continues to be more of a staff role, an influencer role, as opposed to a role that's tied directly to revenue generation. And those companies where it is tied to revenue generation seem to be more firms that are using data to develop data products that can be measured. We've also asked and continue to ask about the long-term role of the CDO within organizations. And there hasn't been much change overall over the course of the past 4 years in terms of those who believe that the CDO should sit on the executive committee and those that believe that the CDO should be one level down. It really has been largely split. Probably the most even split is in 2021. So organizations continue to struggle and think through what is the proper mandate and what is the proper reporting relationship for the chief data officer. I will add that we've seen in recent years a range of places where the CDO reports. We saw many organizations where the CDO reported into the chief information officer, but that's becoming less and less. We saw instances where CDO reported into the chief financial officer or chief operating officer, and even a couple instances, but with very large companies, where the CDO reported into the chief marketing officer. And in addition, some places where it reports into the chief digital officer. So this is another area where it's not a settled matter in terms of where the CDO fits within an organization. One piece of good news there is, if you note the last point, we've asked over the years whether the CDO is an interim role that is unnecessary and should be phased out. And in 2019, nearly a fifth of respondents seemed to view this as a temporary role, but this year it was very low. But I would note that some of the firms that are most data-driven, particularly digitally native firms, they haven't felt a need for a chief data officer in most instances because data is so embedded in the DNA of the organization. So you could make the case that having a chief data officer implies that there's a need for somebody to really drive responsibility for data within an organization because it isn't sufficiently embedded within the organization's DNA.
And the transition role comes from knowledge that a lot of people have, that the CEO role, what we call now the chief executive role, used to be called the chief electrification role, which was in fact a transition role, because as soon as people figured out how to use electricity, you didn't need a chief electrification officer anymore. So the theory is perhaps we'll get to learn how to use data and go forward in that. Randy, there's a very specific question on this tier that I think is really good to read right at this point. I'm sorry, it's tiny, so I'm going to try to read it properly here. Why should tier 2 and SMB, so small medium enterprises, get bogged down with the IT complexities where they could be offered apps in capital A that responds to all enterprise needs at the screen level and takes control of all the MDM data issues behind the scenes? If such a service existed at 1/2 the cost of today's migration, today's cloud migration, responding straight to the CEO, CFO, CMO business challenges versus forcing the enterprise to build an enterprise IT Taj Mahal and still not getting it right. The question is, wouldn't this be better market solution than the way industry is doing it today? I'll be happy to reread that for you, sir. I would hate to try to parse it. I think the question at the end is there a new model, right? And is there a way people should be looking at this?
You know, I would just comment, my comment will be shorter than the question, that each company is really different, and each company has to look at its own culture and determine what works best for that organization when the day's done. And I think that there is a lot of commonality across companies, but you know, each organization has to figure out how they're going to ease into data and what their mindset is going to be in terms of how they view data as a business asset and how they manage data in terms of the organizational hierarchy.
Thank you.
The final theme that came out of the survey is just a continuation of this notion of that the CDO role remains a work in progress. One of the measures for many organizations has been whether the CDO is focused more on defensive or regulatory and compliance activities. And back in 2009, 2010, particularly in financial services, that was really where the mandate for the CDO role came out of. It was almost a check the box requirement for a number of financial services firms, particularly large banks. But over time, particularly looking at the Amazons and Googles, companies have recognized that there's a great opportunity to use data to gain insight and to build customer relationships and ultimately to drive revenue. And as a consequence, more and more CDOs are focusing on the offensive activities as opposed to the defensive. I will say that, you know, at the MIT Chief Data Officer Symposium panels dating back 3 or 4 years ago, I'd ask each of the CDOs to describe whether they were spending more of their time on offense and more of their time on defense. And they would always say that they were spending most of their time in offense. And I just really didn't believe it because it didn't correspond to A, what I saw in the survey, or B, what the line of business executives told us. But I think for 2021, that is pretty accurate that a significant majority, more than 2/3 of CDOs are really focused more on offensive and revenue generation activities now. I think that that's pretty much become a consensus and established position. And then lastly, and this again can be disheartening from the perspective of the glass half full or half empty, but encouraging from the perspective of long-term employment and opportunity. And that is we've asked about the success of the CDO role, and really only 1/3 of organizations state that the role is successful and well established within their organization, and the majority, roughly 2/3, point that they're still continuing to struggle. Either the role is nascent and evolving, or they're continuing to struggle with turnover, which still continues to be pretty common. for multiple factors, including organizations having unrealistic expectations or continuing to refine what their expectations are of the role. So I think this represents the greatest challenge as well as the greatest opportunity for executives that are sitting in the Chief Data Officer role today. So I'll pause, and I'm happy to answer additional questions for another 5 or 7 minutes, and then I just have some closing slides on suggested reading and other places to look for more information on this topic.
Super. So here's a good pertinent one. You mentioned that you had added AI to the survey. I'm wondering if you're aware of Amy Webb's book, The Big Nine. She was at the MIT conference, I think, 2 years ago, and presented a line of research that she was saying that if you're not one of these 9 major companies, 3 of them are outside of China, or maybe 3 of them are inside of China and the others are outside of China, you really aren't doing anything in AI. And I think that very much contrasts with the 90% of organizations that are achieving value from this. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Tom Davenport and I just published last Friday an article in MIT Sloan Review that, and it was based upon the survey, that just relative to the AI aspect, a vast majority of firms indicated that they were now making investments in data-driven aspects of AI, specifically, machine learning, deep learning. So we're seeing organizations undertake more and more AI initiatives, but at the same time, Tom and I have been engaged in the process as part of this series of interviewing firms in terms of case studies in AI where they've been able to demonstrate measurable outcomes and business results, and that's harder to get at. So we see more and more firms undertaking AI initiatives, executive management committed to exploring ways that AI could be used within those firms, but identifying outcomes is less certain at this point in time.
Okay, great. Another question around barriers. What experience, what knowledge, what insight can you add here about organizations that are looking to break down barriers? And we also have a number of requests for your contact information, which is on your slides and things like that. But obviously there are people who are interested in this.
Okay, contact information is, well, you can see the website, but it's also rbean, R-B-E-A-N, at newvantage.com. And I'm sorry, what was the first part of the question?
The question is, what are organizations doing to break down barriers to this? Because we're still seeing barriers out there. Do you have any sort of sense from all the talking, all the consulting, all the research that you've done?
Yeah, they're undertaking a number of initiatives, and again, so many of these are human and people related. I just spoke 2 days ago with the Chief Data Officer, Mano Manachar, at the Travelers, and I've written about this so I can speak about it. I wrote about it in Forbes a year or 2 ago, and that is their efforts to really build a data culture in a significant way. And they have a series of programs where they're training thousands and thousands of employees on aspects of data literacy and understanding the sources and uses of data within the organization, understanding the lineage from production to consumption. It's my experience that that's where it really gains traction within organizations, when the business people understand how data is being used throughout the organization, and because then it becomes concrete as opposed to abstract. So just in terms of cultural change, it's really so much is around communication and education, and then working to develop the right organizational structures. So technology folks, line of business folks, and data folks are really working in close collaboration, breaking down the silos, breaking down the walls, creating hybrid teams, having people work together in centers of excellence or sandboxes that are focused on specific business problems. We really find that collaboration is the key to progress.
And I'll also echo a comment that you made earlier too about CDO also standing perhaps for Chief Diplomat Officer. And that speaks to a very key role that's in that component as well. One question here specifically around data ownership. So data ownership and accountability is a big challenge in many companies. Do you think that appointing a Chief Data Officer will take care of that, or will the challenge still remain but managed by the CEO?
Yeah, no, it hasn't taken care of it. Just pointing out two pieces of data in the survey, where we mentioned that 65% of organizations had appointed a Chief Data Officer, but 24% of organizations still had identified no single point of accountability. And even with 65% having appointed a Chief Data Officer, only 49% have the Chief Data Officer as the person with primary responsibility for data. So it helps. It can be a step in the right direction, but it's a part of the puzzle or part of the process. There has to be ultimately there has to be organizational buy-in at all levels that about what the mandate of the Chief Data Officer is, and buy-in that would be the right place for there to be ultimate accountability for data, assuming that that's what the organization, based upon their culture, believes.
Super. Another question here. Why are CEOs less interested to participate in this survey? I don't know that you explicitly excluded them, but they go on here to say, could it be that they don't like / understand IT complexities and are throwing the responsibility more on the shoulders of CDO, CIO, CTO, et cetera? If this is the case, and I'll go ahead and respond to that, I'll read it to Kathleen.
Well, that's a very funny question and a good question, because those CEOs that have access to and know, they have a huge amount of responsibility for all aspects and lines of business within their organization. And though a few will respond and say, yes, I can respond directly, they're much more apt to refer us to the Chief Data Officer. They'll say, oh, this is so important for our organization, and here's the person to speak to because they can answer and respond most fully. So, it's really a case of what's the word I'm looking at? Delegation to the person they believe is the most appropriate respondent.
Okay. Well, we're at the point where you need some time to do your wrap up on this. So I'll pause the questions here and let you finish the points that you wanted to make on this, Randy.
Yeah, I just mentioned that continue to write a lot on this topic. Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and MIT Sloan Review. The piece, Why Is It So Hard to Become a Data-Driven Company, just appeared in HBR on February 5th, I believe it is, so that's very fresh. Are you asking too much of your Chief Data Officer? That was a piece written just about a year ago this time in conjunction with Tom Davenport, where we identified 7 different roles of the Chief Data Officer, which ranged from Chief Data Officer as revenue generator in some instances, to Chief Data Officer as Chief Data Steward, to CDO as a Chief Privacy Officer. So we used case study examples and instances in industry to point out different flavors of the CDO role. At MIT Sloan Review, Why Chief Data Officers Must Assume Leadership for Data Success, that's a November-December 2020 article. And Why Culture is the Greatest Barrier to Data Success, that's a September 2020 article. So those are both very fresh. And in Forbes, have been writing a number of case studies about what specific organizations are doing. So within the past year, Cigna, American Express, MasterCard, TD Bank are among the organizations that have been featured in those case studies. And it's good to see what specific organizations are doing. I did want to call out MI Chief Data Officer CDO IQ Symposium. As mentioned, I've been hosting and moderating and organizing a keynote panel for about 7 years now. This year's panel will be on Tuesday, July 20th, talking about really bringing some perspective, saying, this role has been in progress for a decade. How has it evolved? What's next? And in terms of panelists, we'll have chief data officers representing 5 leading companies. Wells Fargo, Truist, which is the combination of SunTrust and BB&T Bank in the North Carolina. So I believe now it's I'm going to say the 6th or 7th largest regional bank, or 6th or 7th largest bank in the United States altogether. Eli Lilly and Company, TIA, and Prudential. So it should be an interesting discussion from 5 very accomplished CDOs. And lastly, as mentioned, because I had some time, because I wasn't traveling, have pulled together many of the learnings and perspectives of the past decade or more into this book, Fail Fast, Learn Faster, Lessons in Data-Driven Leadership. And it also includes extensive case studies. I've been amused or intrigued by some of the initial reviews of people that sent copies of the book. So inspiring and terrifying. So I guess it's going to engender both hope and fear, inspiring and cautionary. Again, opportunity and excitement to do great things, but also concerns and fear about some of the challenges that exist. Jeffrey Moore sees big data is indeed crossing the chasm. It's mentioned a lot of case studies and anecdotes. Don Peppers and Martha Rogers, who wrote the acclaimed bestseller One-to-One Future. They call it a whirlwind tour of real-world business cases. So for those who choose to dig deeper, and 2 CDOs, by the way, John Bottega, who was a former chief data officer at Citigroup, Bank of America, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, now president of the EDM Council. He talks about the discussions around the rise of the chief data officer, and Allison Suggraves, who was chief data officer at M&T Bank and has been a leader in the CDO space. So hopefully you'll have a chance to, and you can go to the website failfastlearnfaster.org to read a little bit more about the book in advance.
And Randy, we're out of time at this point, but I wonder if we could engage you to come back and talk about the book when it gets published next fall, perhaps.
It would be a pleasure, and I'm sure the publisher would welcome that.
It's always great to talk to you. We had a bunch of really engaged questions and a little bit of dialogue out there. I want to thank everybody for participating in this wonderful event, and Randy, for sharing your time and thoughts with us. It's really important that we keep an eye on this, because as you noted, there's a lot to be learned out there, and things are moving extremely fast. Failing fast and learning faster sounds like really good advice, and maybe Facebook wanted to listen to that at some point.
Great. Well, thank you, Peter. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely. And just for everybody that's listening in here, we have next month, Doug Laney will be giving us the business case for the CDO. And perhaps, Randy, if you're still stuck at home, you can submit some slides in there as well to, or some questions in there for Doug as well, because he's always a fun interview as well. Randy, thank you so much for taking the time today to do this. It's just been packed full of information. I would urge everybody to go out to NewVantagePartners.com, their website, and download a copy of that survey. It doesn't cost anything. In fact, I think, Randy, you don't even make them register for it.
No, it's free for all. Have at it, please.
It's fantastic, and he's done a great job of this, and we'll look forward to A, seeing you at MIT this summer, hopefully, and B, looking forward to a return engagement in the fall then on this. Thank you so much for your time, Randy.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you all for participating in this.